Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a good amount of people online, and I don't want to keep us waiting any longer. So first of all, I just want to say welcome to everybody who's joining us today for our virtual open house for our short range transit plan update. My name is James Boyle. I'm the Director of Planning. And today we just want to share with you some updates from SRTP and also give you a chance to speak to us and share with us any of your comments or questions you may have. I am going to turn it over. We have a few panelists from SacRT online today, so I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves from SacRT. James?
Hi, everyone. I'm James Drake. I'm Principal Planner with Sacramento Regional Transit. I work for James Boyle, and my focus is bus route schedule development, ridership analysis, and related.
Thanks, James. Laura?
Hi, everyone. This is Laura Ham. I'm the VP of Planning and Engineering with SacRT. In addition to planning and engineering, I'm responsible for facilities maintenance and DBE here at SacRT. Welcome.
Thank you, Laura. And Priscilla?
Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm Priscilla Vargas, and I'm the Acting ADA Compliance Officer for RT, and I report to Carmen Alba. I am involved with a lot of things related to compliance for bus, rail, and paratransit service.
Thank you, Priscilla. And before we move on, I just want to remind everybody that we are recording today's presentation. So we will have a recording of it and it will be made available online. And I also want to encourage you that if you have a question or if you have a comment, to please use the Q&A section on Zoom. We would prefer you not to put it in the chat box because we want to capture it in the Q&A. And so when we get to the end and we try to answer some of your questions or read your comments, we will start with the Q&A box first, and then if we have time, we'll check out the comments. Next slide, James. Okay, so today we are here to talk about a short range transit plan. And I just want to quickly let everyone know what is a short range transit plan. Basically, this is a planning document that outlines all plans in transit service and operations for a 5 to 10 year period. And all transit agencies that receive direct federal funds are required to have a short range transit plan. And we have called our short range transit plan SacRT on the Move. So this document will address service and operations for fiscal year 2022 to fiscal year 2026. And in this document, we will be evaluating several different things. We will be looking at our fleet needs. We will be looking at capital costs and revenues, operating costs and revenues. We will also talk about future projects and new services. Next slide, James. So why are we doing a short range transit plan? For many reasons. First of all, it is a requirement of the Federal Transit Administration and of SACOG. For us to receive federal funds and regional funds, we are required basically by law to produce a short range transit plan and make sure that we are updating it every 5 years. The previous plan that we are operating under currently was a 10-year plan. It was done back in 2012, and it covers right up until fiscal year 2022. So we are getting pretty close to the expiration of our existing plan. And so that's why we're here today. We're in the process of updating our plan, and we certainly want to present to you some of the major things that have happened in the past couple of years, and then again, give you a chance to talk to us. So talking about some of the big things that have happened the past few years, I don't need to tell most of you that, SacRT Forward was a major project for our team here at SacRT and for the community. And this was basically when we redesigned our entire bus system. And that service was implemented in September of 2019 and it's still running today. So we definitely want to talk about the impacts of SacRT Forward, and you will see some of that further on in the presentation. And no doubt that COVID-19 pandemic has played a major role in transit, not only for us, but for everyone really around the world. We've seen a lot of decreases in ridership at the very beginning onset of COVID-19. And while most of our system is currently all operating, ridership is still down in some respects, and we'll talk more about that further in the presentation. But even through the pandemic, we have still seen a lot of growth and new development coming online in Sacramento and Sacramento County. So we still need to be very much aware of, the people who are moving to our region, the new development that's occurring. And so this plan hopefully will react to that as well. Next slide, James. Okay, so the goals and strategies of SacRT Forward, as I stated earlier, will continue to be very influential as we can develop this short-range transit plan, and we talk about the future services and plans that we have for our area. And many of you know James Drake. He's our principal planner, and he is going to take over the presentation and walk you through some of the results from SacRT Forward and talk about some of the other impacts that we've seen over the past few years on our transit service. And then we will take your questions and comments at the end of the presentation. So I encourage you, if you have a question, again, use the Q&A box there and type your question in, and we will respond to you the best we can, and hopefully we can get to everybody. But if we are not able to respond to you today, we are going to capture all of your questions and your comments. We're going to document them, and we will respond back to you. And again, we'll post everything online as well. So James, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you walk us through the rest of the presentation.
All right. Thank you, James. And thanks again to everyone for being here. It's nice to see a good turnout. So it was just a little over 2 years ago that we launched our brand new bus network. And at that time, of course, we had no idea that the pandemic was coming our way. So quite a bit has changed since then, which makes it really important that we're doing this SRTP update now. But certainly one of the things we wanted to do as part of this SRTP update was to go ahead and take a look at how that new bus network worked out. We launched it in September 2019, and we had just about 6 months of experience with it before the pandemic broke out. And although that wasn't a ton of time, it did end up being enough time for us to capture some data and do some analysis on what worked, what didn't, or at least what our perceptions of that are. So that's something we wanted to share here today. I'm not going to go too into the background on the system, but I want to kind of jump. This is kind of a profile of the system before SacRT Forward, before our new bus network. And one of the takeaways here, this chart indicates the headways of each of our routes on each of our 3 service days. And that color green indicates routes that ran hourly. You'll notice we had a lot of hourly service on weekends. And you'll also notice that the number of routes goes down pretty significantly from weekdays to weekends. And that's something I'll come back to. That's one of the things we took on head on with SacRT Forward. But in broad strokes, some of the strategies for SacRT Forward this was kind of a consolidation and a simplification exercise. This was not a major expansion plan. We didn't have a pile of new funds. This was not in response to a new sales tax initiative or anything like that. This was more of a cleanup effort to take a system that really hadn't been looked at comprehensively for many, many years and to look at what's working, what's not working, and try some new things in places where we thought it was right for a little bit of change. Numerically speaking, what did we do? Well, like I said, a lot of this was kind of consolidation. So we went from 40 down to 27 regular all-day routes, but all 27 of those routes now have 7 days of service. And most or many of them have better than hourly service, at least during the daytimes. That ended up being one of our major goals. Is when we started off, one of the assumptions we had going in was that one of the big outcomes would be a lot more frequent service on weekdays, a lot more 15-minute headway service. What we found as we began to dig in was not only is that very expensive, but we also kind of felt that our weekend network just was so deficient that it was hard to be usable as kind of a basic network in terms of basic connectivity. So the project altogether numerically ended up being about 3.8% of an increase in level of service. Like I said, it's not a huge expansion plan, but we did end up increasing total service levels a little bit. What did we expect in terms of ridership, and how did that end up? This is a little technical. I'm not going to get into the details, but basically what this slide says is that for growing the system about 4%, we were expecting about a 1% increase in ridership. We were hoping to do a lot better than that, but that's what we were budgeting. And that's kind of based on what are actually some pretty industry standard metrics and numbers that usually when you increase service, your ridership doesn't go quite as much because you typically already have service out on the places that are the best places for routes. So how did it end up? We looked at the month of February 2020. This was a nice period to look at for analysis. It was right before the pandemic, but it was 6 months after we launched. So it gave us a good amount of time for the service to kind of ramp up and for the ridership to mature. In raw numbers, ridership was up almost 20% on a year-over-year basis, on kind of a before and after basis. But in order to be fair, there were a couple other factors we wanted to take into consideration. One of which was Ride Free RT, which is our student-free ride program. And that actually launched 1 month after the new network. It launched in October 2019. And that project had a huge ridership response. We estimated that 12.5% of that ridership growth was just from students on the Ride Free program. And then we also looked at other transit agencies that had changed nothing. And just kind of on a status quo basis, we saw that the industry was up about 3% in that month, just based on a little better weather on a year-over-year basis and other economic factors and trends. After deducting all that, our finding was that we could say that quite fairly, quite reasonably, that ridership had grown about 3.8% strictly as a result of the new network, which just 6 months in, we thought was pretty good. To break it down a little bit, if you look at that bottom line, the column on the left is the ridership, which went up 3.8%, and the column on the right is revenue hours, which is how we measure our level of service, and that also went up 3.8%. So in other words, for every dollar we spent, we got a similar amount of riders. And as I mentioned earlier, we were budgeting a little more conservatively. We expected this to not lose riders, of course, but to just do a little better than break even, because it really wasn't a big expansion plan. So overall, we were actually pretty pleased with the big picture ridership results. What we've done since then is we've drilled into the route level results, and we've seen some routes where we think we could have done better and some that worked really well. And then on a day-by-day basis, what this chart also shows is what I mentioned earlier, that a large part of this project was actually reallocation of hours and service levels from weekdays to weekends to kind of shore up that weekend network. And for instance, like on Sundays, we increased the level of service 75%. We almost doubled Sunday service levels. And ridership went up 37%, which is pretty strong for that kind of investment. So this was kind of the before condition, and the after condition, as the charts kind of see, and with that same color scheme, there's still some green indicating those hourly routes, but there's a lot more blue indicating 30 to 45-minute headway service. And it's basically the same number of routes each day of the week. So what we've really kind of accomplished is having a little more of a 7-day network, a little more usable for people who don't necessarily work just Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. And this coincidentally ended up being pretty handy when the pandemic broke out. We were able to pretty quickly and easily just change on a temporary emergency basis to just run Sunday schedules 7 days of the week, and then run Saturday schedules when the pandemic and the lockdowns first broke out. And that really kind of simplified things a lot for us and for our customers to have routes and schedules that were already kind of developed and known. That kind of covers SacRT Forward. I'm going to change gears here a little bit and jump back to kind of now and post-pandemic. This is a part where I also want to recognize Sarah Poe, our assistant planner, who is actually the lead on this project, but sadly was called away today, is not feeling well. So I'm pinch hitting, but the one to feel bad for is Sarah, because she's homesick and she's done a nice job getting us here and ready to go. But looking now at our experience since the COVID-19 pandemic, this is our ridership month by month. And obviously we had a huge drop in ridership when the pandemic launched. Basically, we lost about 70% of our ridership overnight. We went down to about 30% of normal levels. Now, over the year, especially over 2021, we have started to see ridership climb back up. We've seen an interesting difference between bus and rail. Our bus system is now back up to about 50% of normal, whereas our rail system is only up to about 40% of normal. This chart breaks down ridership on a route by route basis on weekdays. I'm not going to go through every route, but the takeaway here is we in transit, we really kind of have three major markets. We provide service for a lot of transit dependent people. We provide rides for a lot of commuters, and then we have a lot of student riders. And when the pandemic broke, those commuters and those students both basically stopped riding. So we were cut down to basically 1/3 of our normal market. What we've seen recently this summer is that our school and our student ridership has bounced back, but our commuter ridership really hasn't. And that's that kind of red area in the upper right. Those are our commuter focused routes. And this is just our most recent month. This is October 2021 compared to before the pandemic. So you can see that those commuter routes really have continued to struggle to bring back riders. Many of them are down even more than 70% from their pre-pandemic norms, whereas the school routes are actually doing a little better than even our kind of our ordinary weekday routes. We talked about other things that the SRTP looks at. It's really kind of in some ways, it's kind of a postscript to SacRT Forward. We looked at the entire bus network in SacRT Forward, but here we are a couple years later, and we have a formal plan that's in need of update. We have not just the pandemic and not just SacRT Forward, but a heck of a lot has changed in our service area. Things don't change particularly fast, but over the course of 5 or 10 years, a lot of things do change, and there's more big changes on the horizon. So just to list a couple big ones, Metro Air Park and Greenbrier, large developments out near the airport, are already beginning to come online. Delta Shores has been built now for several years with respect to shopping and retail, and more development in that area is on the way. So that's another area we're looking at for future service. Innovation Park is the term for the old Arco Arena site. And some of those properties have already begun developing, and a lot more is now on the way, on the horizon. Similarly, kind of west of Natomas is an area of the county, which is referred to as the Upper West Side. That's in the early planning stages now. And then in the southeast county, or south of Rancho Cordova, the Jackson Corridor area has been in planning for many, many years now, and it's getting closer and closer to building permits. So that's yet another area where we're looking at what's coming online and some of our early embryonic plans. To put things into context here, a lot of what we do with the SRTP is, this takes a lot of questions and turns them into concepts. It does some high level and early stage planning. A lot of what we're trying to get are cost estimates and basic conceptual plans, a route map, that kind of thing, and to inventory all those. And in that way, to provide a basis for an informed and organized discussion, not just with ourselves, but in particular with our stakeholders, our members of the public, and our board. So the output of the SRTP is not a complete, comprehensive, actionable plan, but it is a project where we hope to solicit and sort through input on what our priorities should be. We hope to be able to evaluate those trade-offs. What does it cost to serve area A versus B? How urgent is the need? So community feedback is a big thing. It's kind of an early opportunity. It's a chance for folks to get involved early. And it's a chance to really put some numbers on these discussions so that it's not just kind of abstract. We are just about to Q&A here. Let me see. Oh, we have, in the spirit of sharing a little bit of what we've been working on, we have, at this stage of the SRTP, we have done some work on many of the things that will be in the draft plan, but we're still taking input on many others. One of those things that we know will be in the plan is the output from our network integration plan, which was completed just earlier this summer. This was a project related to our acquisition of new light rail vehicles for the Gold Line and the conversion of the Gold Line and eventually the entire system into a low floor light rail system. We spent the last year doing kind of an SRTP-like project of kind of putting pen to paper, penciling out scenarios, getting closer to operations ready status for how we will incrementally improve the Gold Line as our new light rail vehicles and station improvements come along. The draft timeline for that is that in 2023, we'll begin receiving those low floor LRVs. Our first step in terms of service changes will be 15-minute headways out to Folsom during rush hour, peak hours, when we have the busiest trains. Following shortly after that, after we receive a few more of the vehicles, we plan to add additional tripper service in between the regular 15-minute trains. So you'll have trains every 15 minutes at this point out to Folsom, and then we'll slot additional trains in between those to help out with that peak hour capacity. In 2025, we plan to bump that 15-minute headways to Folsom up to all day. And then in the outer years, 2026 and 2027, the emphasis will change to downtown when we realign the Sacramento Valley Station and build connecting track from the Sacramento Valley Station over to the Green Line on 7th Street. That will allow us to combine the Gold Line and Green Line into one line. So you'll be able to take a train from Sunrise or Folsom all the way out to Township 9, Richards Boulevard. A few other things that we know that we're already looking at in the short range transit plan. One of those is the span of service. That's the term we use for basically the begin and end time in the morning and the evening, and also what time in the evening we drop down to longer headways. we thought this SRTP would be a good time to take a look at the whole system and make sure things are clean, orderly, and tidy in that respect. If we have a major, connection point, for instance, at University 65th Street Station, do we have any of our routes ending significantly earlier than the rest of the routes? If so, do we have the ridership there to support adding a little more evening service so that customers can experience a little more uniformity when they get out there, so that that last bus has more of a universal connection all the way through the end of the day, whether you're riding from rail to bus or bus to bus. The price tag for this is pretty significant. We don't know that we can afford all of this, but like I said, one of the purposes of the SRTP really is to put a price tag on different things that we think we need in our analysis, or that we've heard we need from our stakeholders. So we have a price tag for what we think is a pretty comprehensive cleanup of the span of service, adding a little bit of morning service and a fair amount of evening service throughout the week. Another big one I mentioned earlier with SacRT Forward, we originally thought we were going to emphasize getting more 15-minute frequent routes in the system. We ultimately found that it was pretty expensive and it might not be the highest priority. But we wanted to go back and put some numbers to a few routes. Foremost is Route 30, where we actually used to have 15-minute headways. It's a major route for us on J Street from downtown out to Sac State. And with SacRT Forward, we rolled headways back to 30 minutes during the midday. And based on customer feedback, as well as the data we've looked at, we felt that that's something we may want to rewind a little bit and go back to 15-minute headways all day. The other two routes we're looking at are Route 81 on Florin Road, and particularly on 65th Street, where the headways aren't yet 15 minutes. And also on Route 87 on Howe Avenue, which, like Route 81, is a connecting route and a crosstown route for a lot of other routes. Timeline. I mentioned earlier kind of the scope and objective here to get basic concepts and cost estimates for a variety of service, to kind of catch things up to an operating environment that's changed a lot over the last 5 or 10 years. We're here in fall of 21. We're here while the project is still in a relatively early stage, because we want to get that input now so we have time to look at things that percolate up as high areas of interest. The next real step will be, this winter going into early next year, putting together the actual draft plan. So that'll be another milestone where members of the public can review the plan. You'll have something nice and orderly in writing where you can go through and see comprehensively what we've laid out as a potential plan for the next 5 years, and the pros and cons and justifications of it all, and provide your comments. And then we hope to, in spring, be taking the final version to our board of directors for adoption. So let's see, James went over how to do Q&A in Zoom. Once again, I guess I just say, it looks like everybody's already abiding by this. I think I see 6 questions queued up, but just to reiterate, yeah, we'll take questions from the Q&A feature first. And then if there's any time left, if there's any other questions in the chat, we'll address those. I think I want to close here. Our last slide, I want to recognize once again, Sarah Poe has been working her tail off to get us where we are today on this short range transit plan. She is the contact on this. We love to take your comments and questions today. We'll field as many as we can. But should you think of a question or just a comment later on that you want to send to us, something that you want to get to us in writing, please just email it directly to Sarah. She's online and on call to take your comments on this project, and her email is on screen here. And I will go ahead and enter it in the chat as well for anyone who wants it for text format or maybe can't see the screen. With that, James, I think I'll turn it back to you for maybe some closing remarks, and then I can maybe queue up the Q&A question.
Yeah, that'd be great, James. If you can go look at the Q&A, and Again, James, thank you so much for that very informative presentation and kind of setting us up for discussion. And I also do want to recognize Sarah Poe. She's put a great deal of effort into this project. And I'm sorry that she's not feeling well today and she can't be with us, but just want to say thank you to Sarah. And I did want to mention, James went through some of the possible service improvements that we're already looking at. And, we continuously get feedback from our riders and from our customers, and we keep track of that. And so a lot of what James proposed or showed you in terms of, some of the specific improvements like to Route 30, those we are reacting very specifically to comments that have been made to the board or to emails and things that come into our customer service. So I just want to let everyone know that when you send us those emails or you call customer service, we do get those and we do keep track of them. And we do everything we can to respond to you and include your comments in projects like this. So James, I appreciate you kind of giving an early little look there at some of the things that, we're looking at. And so James, you have the Q&A there in front of you, I think, right?
Yeah. Would you like me to begin with the first question here?
Yeah, if you would, please.
First question's from Mike Barnbaum. SacRT Forward was a major project. I'm glad that many people were involved to make it happen and what it is today. In looking back and looking ahead, are there things you would change and do any differently and therefore encompass in the SRTP today? I know I have a one or two things that come to mind, and I can maybe lead. James, if you want to follow up.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead. Start it off.
The first one I mentioned already was frequency on Route 30. Another one that I think is pretty high on the list is we made some changes to Route 19 and really to the North Highlands area that have been a pretty big source of complaint. We formerly had Route 80 running east-west service on Elkhorn Boulevard from Watt Avenue all the way over to Auburn Boulevard on the other side of 80. It wasn't a super heavily used segment of any route or of that route, but when we reorganized service in that area, when we were all done, we ultimately lacked an east-west option across Elkhorn Boulevard and across that freeway. And that has really come up in complaints from customers. It's come up from bus drivers. That's one we've been wanting to look at, that we have looked at a little. I anticipate we'll be offering some potential route changes to address that. Those are the first two that come to mind. There are many others, but those are kind of the biggies.
Okay.
The second question here, this is also from Mike Barnbaum. Mike, unsurprisingly, asked a lot of questions. Always, thank you, Mike, keeping us on our toes here. Question number 2, do you envision a major expansion plan, especially if you factor in the newly signed IIJA legislation in Washington, as well as projected state surplus of $31 million? You want to field this one, James?
Sure, I can try. Let's see, major. So Mike, to answer your question, at this point within our SRTP, we are not anticipating any major new influx of funding or cash. But what we want to do is set ourselves up for that. If there's an opportunity for us to take some of this projected surplus that you're referencing, or even if we get a new ballot measure sometime in the near future, we will basically be ready to go with a whole list of service improvements that we could turn on pretty quickly. So great question, Mike. Thanks for asking that.
Next question is from Dan Allison. Coming off SacRT Forward, there was expressed interest by SacRT and the community for more high frequency service supported by additional funding. But it seems as though the focus has been on Smart Ride instead, using available funds in that way. You want to take that one, James?
Sure. Dan, thanks for the question. Good question. So you're right. There's a lot of interest from the community in terms of more frequency. And believe me, that's something that James and I, we really would like to add to the system. And we will continue to advocate and plan for that. And we also will continue, to be hopefully excited and supportive of any new ballot measure that may happen that will help us to fund a more frequent system. And the Smart Ride expansion really, the funding that came for Smart Ride came from an already existing source of funding that was being collected by the Sacramento Transportation Authority that was specifically collected for neighborhood type shuttle services, which Smart Ride obviously fits very well into that category. So it's a great question, Dan. And I think it's an important conversation for the community to have in terms of, any new revenue streams or funding sources, that money will be focused on or geared towards, expanding our transit system in terms of spans of service and also frequency. We did hear a lot during SacRT Florida about, having 15-minute routes and more frequent services. And we definitely would love to have that in the future.
All right. Next question is from Helen O'Connell. Are you going to have new routes to serve the new areas? I might jump in on that one.
Sure.
At this stage, I mean, there's still a lot to add, but areas I know we're looking at, first of all, Delta Shores. There's still some development to happen out there. There's still some road construction that has to happen to connect things. But we are starting to take an early look at fixed route service out there. We would probably start with a simple connection from the new Morrison Creek Light Rail Station out to the shopping, out to the Walmart area. Long run, we'd like to integrate that with the rest of the bus network. But we'd probably start with something like that once the road network's built out. We have considered running Smart Ride out to Delta Shores as well. But one of the issues with that is the nearest Smart Ride zone, the Franklin zone, is already a really large zone. We have kind of held the line on Delta Shores because most of the destinations there are shopping and retail. So there are other options on the network. It is an area that we do get a lot of requests for, but which is kind of remote and separate from the rest of our network. So being mindful of cost containment, we have to take all that into consideration. The airport is another area. I mentioned the Greenbrier and Metro Airport projects. This is basically where the Amazon warehouse is, out there right next to the airport. And there's a lot of new houses that are already up in the Greenbrier area. So there's more that's going to be coming online there. I don't know that we're quite there yet in terms of sending routes out there, but we get a lot of requests for more service out that way. We have restored our airport service, but we get requests either for Route 11 in Natomas or Route 13 up in Natomas to potentially be extended to the airport. So that's something we probably will at least be taking a look at. And then the other big new growth area that comes to mind on the horizon, I mentioned earlier briefly, is the Jackson Corridor area. This one also is still a ways away from being built, but we are getting closer to modeling up, realistic routes to serve this area. It's an area that I think, quite fortunately, the county has done a very nice job of making sure that these large development projects include requirements for funding to fund future transit service. So that makes our job a lot easier when we start getting demand to run bus service out to these new areas.
Oh, James, real quick before you move on, Mike Barnbaum, I think we skipped over one of his before we went to Helen's.
Yeah,
I just wanted to tell Mike that, Mike, we did get your text or your email message, and we will respond to that in a written response once we have a chance to review it and look at it. Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. Let's see. Next question.
Mike
This
Barnbaum.
one also is from Mike. You brought up University 65th. Is the housing development at that station factoring in with regards to ridership forecasts and span of service at that hub, especially to see that bus service ends when rail service ends, once the housing is completed and folks can start occupying new units there. That's probably a pretty short answer. I would say with the new housing there, that's not a huge factor for us when we look at the span of service that I mentioned. Mostly just it's probably not something large enough to kind of move the needle with the level of analysis we do. A lot of our analysis is based mostly on, actual ridership today. And there's a ridership forecasting tends to be pretty speculative and pretty imprecise. So, if you're planning a big new rail line, you may want a model run to get a sense of how many people you'll get. But individual housing projects usually aren't large enough to necessarily yield any kind of numerical or quantitative results for us. A lot of it, frankly, still just relies on professional judgment. So, as much as we like to be data driven when we can, we always adhere to, I think, a balanced approach to also just getting out there, talking to people, listening to members of the public. Next one, also from Mike Barnbaum. I don't know that I know the answer to this. Are there other outreach meetings being planned, either in person, in addition to this virtual meeting and last week's virtual meeting? James, do it.
So I will say,
This phase, right?
yeah, I'll take this one. So Mike, once we get a draft plan in place, what James kind of talked about earlier, like packaging something up, we will take that to the board and present a presentation to the board. But we will also probably schedule another online event such as this one, where planning staff will present that proposed draft SRTP plan to get your comments and feedback. So there will be other opportunities. I'm suspecting it will be late December, January timeframe. I'm not quite sure yet. I'll work with Sarah on getting those dates in stone, but yeah, there will be other opportunities. I just am not very sure that it's going to be in person at this point. We're still kind of doing the virtual thing for now, kind of see how COVID, what COVID does in the fall and winter. But if the opportunity presents itself where we can have something in person, we will certainly consider that. Okay.
Next question is from Dan Allison. Will the SRTP include information on active pilot programs, span of the pilot, and when results will be reported back to the board? Smart Ride comes to mind as kind of the biggest pilot project that we're in. It's a 3-year project that was extended 2 years. We were also right now involved in piloting some new technology with Cal ITP, the integrated transportation project through Caltrans, which is kind of next generation fare collection technology. I might let you field this one, James, on Smart Ride, although I'm happy to jump in too.
There will be a section that will address Smart Ride in our plan. I don't know that we're going to go into a bunch of details about Smart Ride. We're really more focused on the fixed route system, but we will have a discussion or conversation about Smart Ride. And then, at some point, there will be a much detailed, in-depth examination of Smart Ride and kind of lessons learned towards the end of that 3-year period.
Next question is from Mike Barnbaum again. Specific improvements have been shown on 3 routes. Has any consideration been looked at with regards to Route 23, El Camino, for frequency improvements and span of service improvements? I would have to actually refer back to the slides to remember if we looked at span.
You know what, James? I will say, what we presented was just kind of an example or things that we're thinking about. But this meeting is an opportunity, again, for those who are participating to tell us what you think or what you would like to see or what we should be focusing on. So Mike, I think that's a good example of how you bring out a specific route with specific questions. And so I want to encourage other folks who are listening in, if you don't really have a question, but you just want to have a comment about, I would like to see more service on this route or that route, those are things we're looking for too. So I don't know that we're going to address every specific route during this call in the time we have, but we do want to encourage you to submit those questions or those comments, even after this call is over, to Sarah, so that we can at least respond to them.
Yeah, and I can say that checking back on those slides, I couldn't have told you on the spot, but 23 is one that I have evidently looked at for some increases to span. It's a pretty well used route, and you know, I think I get where Mike's coming from, that may be a candidate, at least in Mike's opinion, for frequency improvements. Next question's from Glenda Marsh. Curious about job center areas like Power Inn, large employers there like Siemens, where there's no transit presence from light rail stations, for example. Any plans for adding new service of any type or partnering with employers in areas like this for mass transit type service? You know, in the Power Inn area, that's an area that's always kind of been at the fringe of our network. The ridership levels have always been very borderline in terms of supporting fixed route service, full-size bus service, you know, all day service. We in SacRT Forward, we gave a lot of thought to whether or not we ought to sustain service out in that Power Inn area. And we kind of ended up where we did, with 65th Street kind of being the eastern boundary, and then a little bit of service out as far east as Power Inn, where it's a little more developed, but without any fixed route service on the more industrial parts. You know, in a general sense, I think it's an area that's pretty ripe for something like Smart Ride, which, you know, is kind of a good solution for lower demand areas. But like James mentioned, you know, Smart Ride, you know, people forget, but it is ultimately a pilot project. It's grant funded, and the neighborhoods which we serve, you know, are established in our grant agreement for that funding. So we have some flexibility with those zone boundaries, and it's adjacent to the existing Floor and Gerber zone. So that may be expanding service there is something we could probably look at, if it's, you know, if we don't want to spread ourselves too thin. But I think the case for full size service there is maybe a little questionable, but definitely appreciate the comment. And it's definitely one we get a lot of questions about. So we like to take that seriously. Question from, oh, go ahead, James.
Oh no, I was just going to move on to, I see one from, I thought it was from Helen, but it looks like Mike. There's one from Mike. So, but didn't we already answer that one about the state rail plan? Mike, I think we already covered that. Helen has a question, and she says, please include the MAC board on any of your updates. And Helen, yes, we will do that. We have not forgot about MAC, and I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. And I think Sarah actually did do a presentation of MAC very early on in this when we were getting this project started. So we will certainly come back to MAC and make a presentation once we have a more defined draft plan put together.
And this is Priscilla. I'll just add, James, that Sarah definitely has been providing an update to the MAC on the last 2 or 3 meetings. So they are definitely in the loop.
Great. Thanks, Priscilla.
I think I'm going to jump over to the chat. I have a couple questions from Glenn Mandelkern. And Glenn noted that for some reason, Q&A keeps saying server currently busy. So Glenn's using chat window for questions. I think we should go ahead and take these questions here from chat, and then we'll jump back over to the Q&A side. Question 1 from Glenn. If we weren't in a COVID situation, would this meeting be held in person? Also, will future phases of the SRTP be conducted in person, for example, the public comment period? James, maybe a mix of both, huh?
Well, I would say that if we were not in a COVID period, we would probably be having these meetings in person. But I think we've all learned that the online meetings like this can also be very valuable. So, I think moving forward, we're probably going to be doing both. I mean, we'll have some in-person meetings for sure, but I think we might still continue to offer an online option as well. So, good question.
Question 2 from Glenn. Now that work from home and remote work are becoming very common post-COVID, what thoughts does SacRT have towards service inside suburbs and similar settings where people commute less? How will SRTP cover these developing mindsets? I know a couple things come to mind for me, at least. Like I mentioned, our ridership on our commuter buses has probably been our worst area. We've really seen that struggling. And although financially, RT has been very fortunate to receive a lot of funds from the federal government to help balance us out, we have had some challenges with the nationwide labor shortage. So although we more or less we're doing okay on money, our capacity right now is somewhat limited by manpower. So we are looking at some areas where there may be less demand. With the SRTP, maybe there is less demand for some of that commuter service. I think the suggestion here is that not necessarily to eliminate commuter service to downtown so much as to add service kind of within the community in suburbs. That's frankly kind of a novel suggestion. I mean, not totally novel. A lot of, basic route planning, you've got your radial routes that go to downtown and your crosstown routes that don't touch the downtown. And I think those routes we've seen, decent ridership on those. Those have been ones that haven't been as hard hit, relatively speaking. I would say that typically transit will struggle for shorter distance trips in lower density areas. We compete pretty well on distances where you can't ride a bike and distances where, where they're medium distances from one community to another. It's very difficult, especially in the suburbs where automobile ownership is high, for us to compete with a trip where someone hops in their car and drives just a few blocks, because that's very on demand. There's not a lot of time spent walking to or waiting at a bus stop, either at the beginning of the trip or the end. We tend to compete a little more on those truly cross-town patterns where people are riding, from a Citrus Heights to a Rancho Cordova, from a South Sac, up to, College Green, something like that. There's another question here from Glenn. Route 23, increasing frequency. It's easier to understand and remember the 30-minute frequency versus the 45-minute frequency of Sundays. If 23 could be improved this way, seriously consider it. This is, when we did our new network in 2019, our original plan was to get away from all 60-minute routes and have everything be at least 30 minutes. We backed off from that a little bit because the reallocation of service and resources from weekdays to weekends would have been even more had we done that than it ended up being. And while we did think there was pretty good demand for a significant reallocation like we did, when we ran through the numbers and made our ridership forecasts, we did find that there is such a thing as over allocating to weekends. Demand on weekends is not as strong and complete as on weekdays. And so we ended up with a bit of a split the baby with those 45-minute headways. They are a little a little more difficult to remember. They kind of are a little more irregular, but on certain routes, just based on the length and the running time of the route, it ended up, being that we could get 45-minute headway frequency for the same cost as hourly. And even though it's a little bit awkward, we ultimately felt, hey, 45 minutes is still better than hourly.
Okay, James, we're getting close to 3 o'clock here, and I went back, looked at our Q&A. We got a couple of more questions from Glenda. I think Glenda, one of them is just kind of more. So Glenda, in terms of the P-bids, I will say that, we can definitely reach out to the P-bids and communicate with them about the project and get feedback from the P-bids. So we will be taking a look at that. And what else do we have? So let's see, P-bid Smart Rides. We got another one from an anonymous attendee. The open house has been very informative and shows the team is really looking at travel patterns. Can't wait to see the changes. Well, thank you for your comment, Anonymous. We appreciate that. And again, if we will provide a written response to all the comments that we've received and questions. And so I want to thank everybody for attending our meeting today. I think it's been really great to hear from you. And we certainly do look forward to having in-person meetings as soon as we can. We do miss seeing a lot of you in person. So James, is there anything final you would like to say before we close out?
I think I'm good. Just like to thank everyone for the nice turnout and the good questions.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And please remember to keep checking the website for updates on the project. And again, email Sarah Poe with any questions or comments. So have a great day. Thank you.